I'll destroy everything you built in this community." The HOA president snarled those words at me after slapping me with a $5,000 fine just for hunting on land that wasn't even theirs. Her eyes burned with cold fury behind thick glasses, but I just smiled. These power-hungry tyrants had no idea what storm was coming. 2 months later, I didn't just own their precious forest, I turned their entire HOA board into illegal trespassers overnight. The horror on their faces when they realized they'd been building amenities on my land for years? Priceless. And the security cameras capturing their panic when they received their own violation notices? Justice served ice cold. But how did I get here? Life has a funny way of teaching you lessons about fresh starts. After losing my wife Amanda to cancer 2 years ago, I decided that my daughter Lily and I needed a change of scenery. The hustle and bustle of city life wasn't doing either of us any favors. So, I cashed in some stock options from my software engineering job, found a remote position, and bought a quaint little house on the edge of Pine Ridge Estates. The property backed up to 200 acres of beautiful forest, and I thought it would be the perfect place for an 8-year-old girl to heal and for me to find some peace. The neighbors seemed friendly enough when we first moved in, bringing over casseroles and offering to show Lily around. Everyone except Barbara and Frank Davidson, that is. They gave us tight-lipped smiles and handed us a pamphlet outlining the HOA rules instead of a proper welcome. I've been hunting since I was a teenager. My father taught me everything I know about respecting nature, only taking what you need and honoring the animals that provide food for your family. I have all the proper licenses, follow every regulation to the letter, and hunt exclusively for meat. So one crisp October morning, about a month after we'd settled in, I woke up before dawn, grabbed my gear, and headed into the forest behind our house. It was a perfect day, the kind where the air smells like pine and possibility. By mid-morning, I'd successfully taken down a small buck. As I made my way back home, field-dressed deer in tow, I spotted Barbara Davidson standing at the edge of my property, phone in hand, taking pictures. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I explained calmly that I'd been hunting in the public forest land, showing her my valid hunting license and permits. Barbara's face turned red, literally. She claimed I was violating HOA regulations. Hunting was strictly prohibited in the community due to creating violent imagery and negatively affecting the neighborhood's reputation. When I pointed out that I wasn't hunting on HOA property, but in the forest beyond it, Barbara laughed. She insisted the forest was under HOA jurisdiction according to an agreement with the previous landowner. "You'll be hearing from us about this violation, Mr. Foster," she said before calling the police. Within 20 minutes, both a police officer and Steve Collins, the local forest ranger, pulled up in front of my house. Steve checked my license and confirmed it was valid. But Barbara interrupted. "The issue isn't the legality of hunting itself, it's the violation of our HOA guidelines." Steve looked uncomfortable. He admitted he wasn't entirely sure about the exact boundary lines and suggested holding off on hunting there until things were clarified. As the officer left, I noticed Frank watching the whole scene unfold from the shadows of their porch across the street. There was something in Barbara's expression when she saw the deer, not just disapproval, but genuine pain. She quickly turned away when she caught me looking. The next morning, I found an official HOA violation notice taped to my front door, $500 for illegal and offensive activities on HOA property. Later that day, an email arrived from Barbara, her smug tone practically oozing through the screen. Further violations would result in additional penalties. "We suggest you familiarize yourself with our rules, Mr. Foster." I crumpled the notice and tossed it in the recycling bin. There was no way I was paying a fine for hunting on what I was fairly certain was public land. Instead, I decided to find out exactly who owned that forest. That night, as I tucked Lily into bed and read her favorite story, she looked up at me with her mother's eyes and asked, "Dad, do we have to move again?" My heart nearly broke. I stroked her hair and promised her that this was our home now and we weren't going anywhere. As I closed her bedroom door, I felt a resolve hardening within me. It wasn't just about the hunting or the fine anymore. It was about making sure my daughter had stability. I wouldn't let some power-hungry HOA president push us around. Little did I know, this was just the opening salvo in what would become a full-blown neighborhood war. The next morning, I called the county clerk's office to inquire about land records for the forest behind Pine Ridge Estates. While waiting for them to search their files, I started digging into our HOA and its leadership. A quick search through the Pine Ridge Estates online community forum revealed numerous complaints about arbitrary fines and rule enforcement, almost all involving Barbara or Frank Davidson. Apparently, I wasn't their first target. Out of 28 threads discussing HOA issues, Barbara's name appeared in 24 of them, usually accompanied by words like unreasonable, power tripping, and several colorful expletives I won't repeat here. I was scrolling through these complaints when I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. Saw what happened yesterday. Not everyone in the HOA agrees with Barbara. If you want to talk, meet me at Parkside Cafe at noon. Diane Palmer. I was naturally suspicious but decided to take a chance. Diane turned out to be a sharp-looking woman in her early 40s, dressed in a business suit with a half-eaten sandwich in front of her. I only have 20 minutes before I need to get back to the office, she said, extending her hand. I'm on the HOA board, though not by choice. Got roped into it when nobody else would volunteer. I'm also a real estate attorney, which is why I find this whole situation particularly frustrating. As we talked, Diane explained that Barbara ruled the HOA like her personal fiefdom, and most residents were too intimidated to challenge her. She described how Barbara had made life miserable for anyone who crossed her, constant violations, property inspections, even harassing visitors to their homes. Is that even legal? I asked, increasingly concerned about what I'd gotten myself and my daughter into. Diane sighed and pushed her salad around with her fork. The problem with HOAs is they have a lot of latitude within their own bylaws, and Barbara is very good at finding gray areas to exploit. She lowered her voice. 5 years ago, I owned a different house in Pine Ridge. After opposing one of Barbara's pet projects at a meeting, I suddenly started receiving violation notices for everything, from improper mailbox height to unapproved plant species. When the fines piled up, she threatened to put a lien on my house. I ended up selling at a loss just to escape. Barbara had been president for 15 years, and during that time, she'd used HOA funds to build a private mini-golf course adjacent to her property and renovate her house twice, all classified as community improvements. Despite being primarily for her benefit, I knew I needed to see these operations for myself, so I attended the monthly HOA meeting that evening. Barbara's agenda mostly consisted of trivial matters until she reached the last item, recent violations and community standards. She didn't name me directly, but she made a point of discussing new residents who believe they're above our community guidelines and disturbing activities that threaten our neighborhood's character. When the floor opened for questions, I raised my hand. I'd like to address the claim that the forest behind our properties is under HOA jurisdiction. Can you please share documentation proving the HOA's ownership or management rights to that land? The room fell silent. Barbara's eyes narrowed behind her glasses. We have a long-standing arrangement regarding that property. The developer who originally owned it granted the HOA oversight rights. Frank nodded vigorously beside her. When I pressed for actual documentation, Barbara's face flushed. These matters were settled years ago, Mr. Foster. If you have concerns about our authority, perhaps Pine Ridge isn't the right community for you. A few residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up except Diane. Actually, I'd be interested in seeing that documentation as well. As a board member, I should have access to all property agreements. Barbara abruptly adjourned the meeting, promising to address these concerns privately. The next day, another violation notice appeared on my door, this time for $1,000, citing disruptive behavior and challenging HOA authority. This was getting ridiculous. As I was contemplating my next move, an elderly man with military posture approached my yard. Thomas Jenkins introduced himself with a firm handshake. Lived here since before there was an HOA. Saw what happened at the meeting last night. He told me the development company that originally owned the forest had gone bankrupt 5 years ago. Barbara tells everyone the HOA controls that land, but I've never seen any proof. If I were you, I'd check the county records. You might be surprised by what you find. As Thomas walked away, I could see Barbara watching us from her window across the street. The battle lines were being drawn. That evening, I called my mom to discuss the situation, feeling guilty for even considering asking for her advice after promising to stand on my own 2 feet following Amanda's death. Am I crazy for fighting this instead of just paying the fine, Mom? I asked, staring at Lily's drawing of our new house with "Our Forever Home" written in crayon across the top. My mother's voice was steady as always. Henry, you've always had a strong sense of justice, just like your father. If you believe you're in the right, then stand your ground. But make sure this is a hill worth dying on for both you and Lily. After hanging up, I watched my daughter sleeping peacefully through her partially open bedroom door and made my decision. Tomorrow, I would visit the county records office and find out exactly who owned that forest. And what I found changed everything. The county auction building was cold and impersonal, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, the hum of bureaucracy echoing through the basement room. About 20 people were scattered across folding chairs, some flipping through paperwork, others whispering quietly among themselves. I arrived early, dressed in the only suit I owned, the one I wore to Amanda's funeral, and took a seat near the back where I could observe without drawing attention. My heart pounded so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Everything I had was on the line. My savings, my mother's retirement money, a loan against my house, and even Lily's college fund. I'd mapped out every number on my phone, calculating exactly how high I could bid before I had to walk away. That number was $127,000. Every single cent I could access. But I had no idea if that would be enough. At precisely 10 a.m., Barbara arrived with Frank and 2 other HOA board members trailing behind her like soldiers. The shock on her face when she spotted me was almost worth all the harassment I'd endured over the past few months. She recovered quickly, whispering something to Frank before they took seats on the opposite side of the room. The auctioneer, a bored-looking county employee, began explaining the process and reading the legal description of the property. The minimum bid started at $45,000, lower than I expected, which was good news. But then someone else entered the room, a man in an expensive suit I didn't recognize, who gave Barbara a knowing nod before taking a seat. My instincts told me this wasn't a coincidence. The bidding started conservatively. I raised my hand for the minimum bid, but Barbara immediately countered with $50,000. We traded incremental increases, $55,000, $60,000, $65,000, each time watching each other carefully. By the time we reached $75,000, the limit Barbara had authorization for, according to Diane, beads of sweat were forming on her forehead. But instead of backing down, she conferred briefly with Frank and pushed it to $80,000, clearly exceeding her authority and planning to justify it later as a necessary executive decision. I countered with $85,000. Then the man in the expensive suit finally spoke up, jumping straight to $100,000. My stomach dropped. This had to be Barbara's ringer, someone hired to drive the price beyond what I could afford. She looked momentarily confused, then pleased as she realized what was happening. The auctioneer looked to me for the next bid. I hesitated, knowing I was approaching my absolute limit. $105,000, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The suited man responded immediately, $115,000. I was down to my last possible bid, and everyone in the room could see my hesitation. I needed to make a call, literally. I asked the auctioneer for a moment, and stepped into the hallway to call my mom. "Mom, I need another $30,000. "I know it's your retirement money, but I promise I'll pay it back," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. There was a long pause before she answered. "Are you sure about this, Henry? This is becoming quite the crusade." I leaned against the wall, closing my eyes. It started that way, but now it's about more than just me. Barbara and Frank have been manipulating everyone for years. They're planning to sell this land to developers for personal profit. If I don't stop them now, they'll just keep hurting people. She sighed softly. "Your father would be proud of you standing up for what's right. The money will be in your account in 5 minutes." I thanked her, fighting back tears, and returned to the auction room with renewed determination. $120,000, I announced clearly. The suited man looked to Barbara, who shook her head slightly. He remained silent. Desperation crept into Barbara's expression. $125,000, she blurted out. The auctioneer raised an eyebrow. "Do you have proof of funds for that amount, ma'am?" Barbara fumbled with her phone. "The HOA has authorized this purchase. We can provide additional funds from member contributions if necessary." The auctioneer frowned. "I'm afraid that's not how this works. All bidders must have verified funds available at the time of auction. You can't bid with money you don't currently have access to." Barbara's face flushed as she realized her mistake. I seized the moment. Point of order. As an HOA member myself, I don't believe the board has legal authority to commit to unspecified assessments without a proper vote from all members. The room fell silent. Barbara glared at me with pure hatred. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Unless you can verify funds for $125,000 right now, ma'am, the high bid remains at $120,000. Barbara looked to Frank, who shook his head slightly. She had no choice but to back down. Going Once Going Twice sold to bidder number 17 for $120,000, the auctioneer declared, banging the gavel. I had done it. The forest was mine. As I filled out the paperwork and arranged for the wire transfer, Barbara approached me, her voice low and threatening. "This isn't over, Foster." "Not by a long shot." I couldn't help but smile. "Actually, Barbara, I think it is. By the way, you're standing on my property right now." As we left the building, Frank suddenly turned to me, his composure cracking for the first time. "You have no idea what you're doing. Barbara lost her brother to a hunter like you." The pain in his voice was raw and genuine, catching me off guard. So that explained her extreme reaction to my hunting. It was personal. "I'm sorry about her brother, Frank," I said quietly. "But that doesn't justify what you and Barbara have been doing to this community." He turned away without responding, but I caught a glimpse of something in his expression, perhaps regret, or simply the realization that their carefully constructed world was crumbling. As I drove home, the enormity of what I'd just done began to sink in. I now owned 200 acres of forest and the power to turn the tables on the HOA that had made my life miserable for months. But with that power came responsibility, and I needed to think carefully about my next steps. That evening, I called Diane to share the news. "You actually did it," she said, sounding both impressed and slightly worried. "So, what's your plan now?" "Revenge." It was a fair question. Part of me wanted to make Barbara and Frank suffer, as they had made others suffer. But as I looked out my window at the forest that now really belonged to me, I realized I wanted something more meaningful than mere revenge. "Justice," I replied, "and maybe a little poetic justice at that." The next day, I began making calls to surveyors, attorneys, and the Department of Natural Resources. It was time to establish exactly what I owned and what rights came with that ownership. And then I would give the Pine Ridge HOA a taste of their own medicine. The surveyor arrived early the following Monday, a cheerful woman named Rachel who seemed to find the whole situation amusing. "So, you bought this land off from under your HOA, huh? That's a power move if I ever heard one." We spent the entire day walking the property boundaries, marking GPS coordinates, and comparing the results to the official county records. By sunset, we confirmed what I had suspected. Not only did my newly purchased land include the entire forest, but it also encompassed several HOA amenities that had been built beyond the Pine Ridge Estate's boundaries. Barbara's precious mini-golf course extended a full 30 feet onto my property. The community walking trail crossed back and forth across the boundary multiple times, and the picnic area, where the HOA held its annual summer barbecue, was entirely on land I now owned. This information was gold, but I wanted to use it strategically. I consulted with an attorney specializing in property law, who confirmed I had every right to control access to my land. You could technically demand that they remove all structures and cease all activities on your property immediately, she explained. But that might open you up to claims of easement by prior use if they've been using it for many years. A more strategic approach might be to offer a formal lease agreement under terms favorable to you. This aligned perfectly with what I had in mind. I also met with Ranger Steve to discuss establishing proper hunting guidelines for the property. I want to be responsible about this, I told him. Set up specific hunting seasons, safety zones, the works. Steve was impressed by my commitment to doing things right, and together we developed a comprehensive management plan for the forest that would allow for sustainable hunting while protecting the ecosystem. With my legal rights clearly established, I hired a contractor to install private property signs around the perimeter of my land, along with several well-placed security cameras. I specifically positioned cameras to cover the areas where HOA facilities encroached on my property. Then, under cover of darkness, my contractor installed temporary fencing around those encroaching facilities, nothing permanent or threatening, just clear markers with signs reading, "No HOA access, private property. Trespassers will be photographed and fined." The timing was deliberate. The annual HOA summer hiking event was scheduled for the following morning, with residents gathering at the picnic area before setting off on the trails through what they still thought of as their forest. I didn't have to wait long for the fireworks to start. At 8:30 the next morning, my security app alerted me to movement at the picnic area. I pulled up the feed to see a group of about 30 residents led by Barbara and Frank approaching the fenced area. Their reactions when they saw the signs and fencing ranged from confusion to outrage. Barbara immediately began pulling at the fencing, while Frank took out his phone, presumably to call the police. I had anticipated this and was already on my way to the scene, official property deed and survey results in hand. As I approached, I could hear Barbara shouting to the gathered residents, "This is clearly vandalism, an attempt to disrupt our community event. I've already called the authorities." When she spotted me walking calmly toward the group, Barbara's face contorted with rage. You did this. This is destruction of HOA property." I smiled pleasantly at the assembled neighbors, many of whom looked uncomfortable and confused. "Actually, Barbara, this is my property, as clearly established by yesterday's professional survey." I held up the documentation. "Your picnic area, parts of your walking trail, and most amusingly, 30 feet of your mini golf course are all built on land that now legally belongs to me." A murmur ran through the crowd as this information sank in. Barbara pushed forward, attempting to tear down one of the signs. My security camera captured the moment perfectly, exactly what I needed. Later that day, I had my attorney deliver an official legal notice to the HOA board, with copies emailed to every resident in the community. The notice outlined several key points. First, I was now the legal owner of the disputed forest land, with survey documentation attached. Second, I demanded immediate repayment of the $5,000 fine plus interest for alleged violations on what was falsely claimed as HOA property. Third, I informed them that all HOA facilities on my land were now in violation of property law and constituted illegal trespassing. Finally, I presented them with an ultimatum: either sign a formal land use agreement with specific terms or remove all facilities from my property within 30 days. The agreement included a satirical proposal. I would consider allowing continued access to the trails if Mrs. Davidson publicly apologized via community email and contributed $5,000 to a wildlife conservation fund. Exactly the amount she fined me. The response was immediate and chaotic. Barbara called an emergency HOA meeting that evening, which I attended along with nearly every resident in Pine Ridge. The community center was packed, with people standing along the walls. Barbara tried to maintain control, presenting the situation as an attack on the community. "Mr. Foster is attempting to hold our amenities hostage," she declared. "I propose we take legal action immediately to protect our interests." But the mood in the room had shifted. Residents were asking pointed questions. Why had they never been shown accurate property maps? How had structures been built on land the HOA didn't own? And most importantly, where had their HOA dues been going all these years? The meeting reached a boiling point when Diane stood up and addressed the room. "As a board member, I feel obligated to share some information with all of you." She connected her laptop to the projector and displayed the emails I'd seen earlier, the ones showing that Barbara and Frank had known about the property boundaries for years and had deliberately concealed this information. Even more damning were the emails between Barbara and Granite Peak developers, clearly outlining a plan to sell the forest for commercial development, with Barbara receiving a substantial personal commission. "They weren't planning a community golf course," Diane explained. "They were planning to sell our forest to developers for a strip mall while pocketing the profits." The room erupted. Years of resentment toward Barbara and Frank's heavy-handed rule boiled over as residents realized the extent of the deception. Barbara, in a desperate attempt to regain control, pointed at Diane. She illegally accessed private HOA emails. She should be removed from the board and prosecuted. This only made things worse, as residents were now far more concerned about the content of those emails than how they'd been obtained. Frank tried a different approach, producing a document he claimed bore my signature, supposedly relinquishing any claim to the forest land. "This was signed just last week," he insisted. I stood up calmly. "That's a forgery, Frank. And I have security camera footage of someone breaking into my house 3 days ago. Would you like me to share that with the police?" Frank's face went pale. The meeting dissolved into multiple shouting matches, with various residents calling for Barbara and Frank's resignation. By the end of the evening, a vote had been taken. Barbara and Frank were removed from the HOA board, effective immediately, and Diane was appointed interim president. As the crowd dispersed, I checked my security app one more time and saw something concerning. My cameras had captured someone cutting through the fencing around the picnic area at 2 a.m. The image was dark but recognizable. It was Barbara. I forwarded the footage to Diane and my attorney. This wasn't just trespassing. It was destruction of property and potentially breaking and entering if she'd been the one in my house. The legal consequences for Barbara were mounting, and her reign of terror over Pine Ridge Estates was finally coming to an end. A town hall meeting was organized at the local high school auditorium to accommodate the entire Pine Ridge community, plus representatives from local media who had caught wind of the story. The large room was filled to capacity, tension so thick you could almost see it hanging in the air. Diane, in her role as interim HOA president, opened the proceedings by introducing me and explaining the purpose of the gathering. "We're here to address serious allegations of misconduct by our former HOA leadership and to determine a path forward that serves the best interests of our community." I took the podium first, presenting the evidence Diane and I had gathered, the accurate property survey, the financial records showing misappropriation of HOA funds, and most importantly, the email exchanges revealing the planned sale to developers. Barbara sat in the front row, arms crossed, face set in a defiant scowl. When it was her turn to speak, she approached the podium with a thick folder of documents. "What Mr. Foster fails to mention is that he signed an agreement just 2 weeks ago surrendering any claims to the disputed property," she announced, producing a document with what appeared to be my signature at the bottom. This was witnessed and notarized. A murmur ran through the crowd as Barbara seemed to produce a smoking gun that undermined my entire case. I remained calm, waiting for her to finish her presentation. When she returned to her seat, looking smugly confident, I stood and connected my laptop to the projector. I'd like to respond to Mrs. Davidson's claims with some evidence of my own. The screen filled with security camera footage from my home office, showing a figure that was clearly Barbara using a credit card to jimmy the lock on my back door. Timestamp showed this had occurred 3 days before the auction. Additional footage showed her rifling through papers on my desk, taking something and leaving. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. I never signed any such document, I stated firmly. I believe the police will be very interested in this footage, as well as forensic analysis of that forged signature. Barbara's face drained of color as she realized her desperate gambit had backfired spectacularly. Frank stood up shouting that the video was fake, that I was framing them, but his protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. The real bombshell came when Diane presented financial records showing that Barbara had been embezzling from the HOA reserve fund for years, disguising personal expenses as community improvements. The mini golf course alone cost $75,000, she explained, of which only $15,000 went to actual construction. The rest was diverted to renovations on the Davidsons' home. Several residents gasped at the revelation. An audit committee was immediately formed to investigate the full extent of the financial improprieties, and a vote was taken to pursue legal action against Barbara for embezzlement and fraud. The community also voted overwhelmingly to accept my offer of a reasonable land use agreement, allowing residents to continue enjoying the forest under new, fair guidelines. As the meeting broke up, I noticed Barbara standing alone at the edge of the parking lot, staring at something in her hands. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached cautiously. She was holding an old photograph of herself with a young man who bore a striking resemblance to her, presumably her brother. When she saw me, she quickly wiped away tears. "He was 23, she said without preamble. A stray bullet from a hunter who never even stopped to see what he'd hit. That's why I hate hunting. That's why I hate hunters." Her voice was bitter, but there was also a profound grief that time hadn't managed to heal. "I don't forgive you for what you did to Frank and me," she continued. "But I understand what it's like to lose someone you love and have it change you forever." I didn't offer empty platitudes or try to defend hunting to her. Instead, I simply said, "I'm sorry about your brother, Barbara. I truly am. But that didn't give you and Frank the right to hurt others or to lie to this community for years." She didn't respond, just tucked the photo into her purse and walked away. I watched her go, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing justice done, certainly, but also a recognition of the human cost. Pain had turned Barbara bitter, and that bitterness had corrupted everything she touched. It was a stark reminder of how grief could shape a person's entire life, for better or worse. I was determined that my own grief over Amanda would lead me toward compassion rather than cruelty. 1 year later, the changes in Pine Ridge Estates were remarkable. Barbara and Frank had been forced to sell their home and move away after the civil lawsuit resulted in a substantial judgment against them for misappropriation of funds. The HOA had been restructured with term limits and transparent financial reporting. Most importantly, I had donated a significant portion of my forest land to create a state-certified nature preserve named Amanda's Trail in memory of my late wife. The preserve was protected from commercial development in perpetuity, ensuring that future generations would be able to enjoy its beauty. I worked with Ranger Steve to implement responsible wildlife management practices, including closely regulated hunting seasons in designated areas. Under the new land use agreement, Pine Ridge residents, except Barbara and Frank, who were explicitly excluded, had free access to the forest for hiking, birdwatching, and other non-destructive activities. The walking trails had been properly maintained and expanded with educational signs identifying local flora and fauna. The community picnic area remained in place, though it had been relocated slightly to better protect sensitive habitat areas. As for Barbara's mini golf course, it had been removed and the area restored to its natural state. In its place, we created a children's nature education center where local schools could bring students for outdoor learning experiences. On a warm Saturday morning, I led a group of neighborhood children, including Lily, on a nature hike through the forest. We stopped at a small clearing where Amanda and I had once built a makeshift fort during a camping trip before Lily was born. My wife loved the spot, I told the children as they gathered around, eyes wide with interest. She said you could hear the forest breathing here if you listened carefully enough. One of the younger kids raised his hand. "Why did you keep the forest, Mr. Foster?" he asked innocently. I smiled, thinking about everything that had transpired over the past year. "Because justice needs room to breathe," I answered. "And because some memories are worth preserving more than anger." Later that evening, as Lily slept soundly in her bed, I sat on our back porch, watching the sunset filter through the trees. The forest that had been the center of so much conflict now stood as a monument to something better, not just a personal victory, but a community reclaimed from corruption and a lasting tribute to Amanda. I ran my hand over the wooden sign I'd carved myself. Amanda's Trail, where every step is taken with respect. The HOA battle had cost me financially and emotionally. But what I'd gained was immeasurably more valuable. A home where my daughter could grow up safely. A community built on honesty rather than fear. And the knowledge that sometimes, standing up for what's right really does make a difference, even when the odds seem insurmountable. In the end, I hadn't just bought a forest and made trespassers out of tyrants. I'd helped create something that would outlast all of us, something Amanda would have been proud of. And really, that was all the justice I needed. If this story made you feel better about your own life choices, our job is done.